or as you heard, my name is Michaela Hildebrand, and Nicola unfortunately couldn't be here today. So this presentation is on her behalf, so please do not hold me accountable for what I'm about to say. But just to give you a little bit of background on Nicola, Nicola is, Dr. Nicola Desmond is she's a Wellcome Trust Fellow from the UK, and she's based at the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Trust, a major overseas program in Malawi, where she's the head of social science. And some of the work that I'll be presenting here today is work that she's doing with communities in Tanzania. So let me just load this. So the title of the presentation is Risk, Sex and HIV, Risk, Understanding and Management of Youth in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this presentation is really based on qualitative research. And I think that it's a very long, ongoing story of the lack of use of qualitative research to inform program development, where there's a real lack of that in-depth understanding of the everyday perceptions and conceptions and the everyday realities that young people and young women, I guess in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, who are at greatest risk. So these are some of the themes that'll be emerging are really based on this type of data. And I think that it just highlights the importance of trying to draw together different types of perspectives and move away from the silos of biomedical and structural and social interventions to really looking at biosocial interventions, that there cannot be such a thing as biomedical interventions that do not have a strong social component that does address the surrounding environment of risk. So, combination prevention approaches, as I mentioned, so while they do fulfill, of course, a real critical need in addressing the HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, and we know of the studies that have your randomized control trials behind them, and there are massive scale-up around voluntary medical male circumcision, around, well, now cash transfers, which is more of a social intervention, as well as condom use, etc. But many of these types of programs currently fail to address the everyday risk of young people. And we know that it's not enough to frame HIV in these sort of medical discourse, that we really need to start looking at a different type of frame so that we don't exceptionalize HIV within the medical field, which was also very adequately raised by Professor Patton in his opening remarks. So this presentation, and of course the session overall, is highlighting the diversity of risk that is experienced among young people both among key populations, but also young women and young adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa. And that it's really important to acknowledge this, that if we're going to succeed in HIV prevention programming, we really need to look at the local responses to the epidemic that are really contextually meaningful to young people. And this type of understanding is very often lacked in how prevention programs are designed today. So in order to understand the different risk factors that are relevant to this sort of very diverse, which is a key theme to really recognize that there is a wide diversity of young people, we need to ensure that several criteria are met. So we need to understand the important role of community and the embeddedness of individual agency and sexual behavior within broader social structures that are influenced, of course, by collective social culture, so that we can promote appropriate responses for individuals within those contexts. The second thing is we need to recognize the broader landscape of risk. And as mentioned, that there are always several varieties of different types of risk that adolescents face, and your risk of sexual violence, your risk of HIV, your risk of not being loved tomorrow if you disclose your HIV status. There are many different types of risks that you're facing in your everyday life. And how you respond to HIV needs to be informed by how young people themselves perceive different types of risks and how they respond to risk in their everyday life. And finally, we need to understand risk perception itself as contingent and dynamic, that there are moments of risk and situations of risk, rather than sort of a state of continuous risk perception that somehow can be fixed with knowledge alone, because that is not how risk operates in your everyday life. And risk moments are often framed by sort of multiple and contradictory types of discourses within your everyday situation. So, as I mentioned, this work is really based on qualitative data that's emerging from 2 different settings in Tanzania, where Dr. Desmond explored these 3 different frameworks for understanding risk among young people. The first is research that was conducted along the shores of Lake Victoria in 2 different sites. One peri-urban roadside village en route to the Serengeti with a diversified economy which included business, trading, fishing combined with agriculture. And the second is a rural village with sort of scattered homesteads dominated by cash crop farming with livestock management. And the second setting is a coastal Tanzania in the district of Pangani in the Tanga region, where research was conducted across a whole district composed of inland and coastal villages, which has a 90% majority of Muslim population and income-earning countries ranging from plantation employment to fishing, coconut farming. So the research identified the role of broader social discourses on the ways that young people perceive risk in general. The first is how young people perceive and respond to risk associated with their social position. So following Mary Douglas, which is a pioneer in sort of the cultural theory of risk, the authors of this research argue that the individual's position in a society, as defined by their wider sort of social and economic status, generates distinctive ways of viewing the world, and that these differing worldviews have an impact on the ways that people perceive and respond to risk. And that those people who are in higher social positions, defined as someone as having a higher social reputation or higher income, is more likely to normalize strategies for risk aversion, while those with lower social positions are more likely to normalize risk exposure. Whereas in resource-poor environments, social capital is built in as a strategy to exercise agency in controlling the future and minimizing risk exposure. And social reputation then is kind of managed within these contexts to advance through sort of social contribution, enhancing social reputation, social position, and ultimately supporting capacity to minimize these types of risks, of these multiple types of risks that young people are exposed to. So this is just a quote to try and illustrate this concept of how social capital can really be used as a strategy for risk management. So what they argue is that young people learn this sort of value of cooperative social relationships as a way to manage risk in rural Tanzania. And so the quote from this young person who participated in this focus group discussion is saying, it becomes so easy if people are in a particular group, you get help so easily, contrary to if you are not in that particular group. And people will say that you're not being cooperative and should be neglected during times of need. So really it's about who is in and who is out, and how that social dynamic is managed. A second key social discourse that is impacting young people's capacity to recognize and respond to risk is sort of this balance between being stuck in multiple different spaces of influence between the modern and the traditional, and multiple times of modernities and multiple times of traditions. And what is felt is that very often the sort of hope of older generations are placed upon the shoulders of young people. And it makes them feel pressurized and sort of in adopting different strategies that fit into both the everyday sort of modern context that they find themselves in, as well as trying to respond to the traditional structures and demands within their context. So one example that's been highlighted by the authors is, for example, the pressure that you might be put if you're in the rural areas of Tanzania. There might be pressure put on you to migrate into the center to be successful and to be able to provide for your family. But once you're there, and if you're not able to provide that type of support within that context, instead of coming back and sort of being successful in the traditional sense of being able to provide, you end up staying, which then exposes you to other forms of risk within that context. So these types of conflicting risks are placed upon young people through the lenses of multiple traditions and modernities. And so while their upbringing sort of embeds them in a discourse that could potentially limit their interpretation of what that misfortune actually means to them and inform how they would develop risk management strategies moving forward, because of the way that sort of the public and private discourses around what chance is or what fate is or fatalism in that context. While at the same time, young people are sort of at the forefront of these modernity is a very complex concept, but sort of at the expectations that are associated with development that can be accessed through adopting more modern lifestyles that are sort of associated with wider perspectives outside of the more traditional interpretations of the social reality. And these broader world views really translate to a greater awareness of the role of agency in sort of managing risks, but they also attract the risk-taking to sort of both satisfy the parental expectations of the more traditional structures versus adopting a kind of risk in order to gain to deliver almost on those types of expectations. So as such sort of risk-taking becomes, which is very common, I mean, of young people, not just particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but risk-taking as a whole is a very common characteristic for adolescent period. It becomes a strategy, according to the author, that is associated in Tanzania both with sort of higher social position and a modern lifestyle. So you might actually be encouraged by those social influences to adopt more risky behaviors. So this again is trying to sort of illustrate that position of situated young people who are situated between these different types of discourses. So of course modernity in the sense of being in a big city, in an urban center, of being then a driver of a minibus, a daladala, that of course exposes you to road traffic. I mean, we know among adolescents actually road traffic accidents is the number one contributor of adolescent mortality before HIV, which is of course a huge risk. So the way of managing that sense of risk, of knowing that there are numbers of adolescents and young people and people in general who are killed in road traffic accidents, are managed not necessarily with using seatbelts or sticking to the speed limit, but are managed with using traditional medicines or in sort of adopting in this kind of. So while this is happening within the peri-urban sort of modern context, there are still traces of more traditional culture within those settings as well. So this is again an illustration how this is negotiated within the context of Tanzania. So they're saying, this medicine can be used to prevent car accidents when it's usually applied to the forehead. So many people who drive for a living, they have these scars in the forehead, but these treatments can also be used for the purpose other than just protecting against risk. For example, you can, as a driver, take medicine so that you can get more clients and you can get more money, etc. So again, it's these sort of different perceptions. Excuse me, can I? I work with a youth organization. I'm tempted to do an icebreaker. It's like, it's what I'm used to doing when I have to pour up a glass of water. So this is all very theoretical. It sounds very abstract. It sounds very complicated. How do we actually, what are the implications of some of these understandings for how we do HIV prevention program? There is this sort of desperate need to really try and embed the way that we do social and behavior change for young people within social norms that are specific to these contexts. It's going to be almost impossible to develop appropriate messages within those types of programs if you are not understanding what that context looks like, because you have no idea how those messages or how that program might be interpreted if you don't understand the social environment and the social context in which you are providing that message. So that, I guess, is a very, very core message. And trying to really make some examples around this of how how different types of behaviors that we would, that we sort of, from the stepping outside and looking at from a public health perspective, if you're not understanding what the social context looks like, our interpretations might be very different. So, for example, the concept of early forced marriage might actually be promoted by parents as a way of preventing sort of shameful behavior, such as unwanted pregnancy, or unwanted pregnancy, or pregnancy that is outside of marriage in coastal Tanzania, or early sexual debut, which is sort of encouraged, which is inadvertently encouraged by parents to fulfill expectations of household contributions. So, for example, if you have an expectations of being able to contribute financially, and there are no employment options for you, and you are in the context where you find yourself in, you might end up entering into a transactional relationship, for example, with an older man. And of course, we know that age-disparate relationships is one of the core sort of mode of transmission or route of transmission for young women in sub-Saharan Africa. Early sexual debut, I mean, this of course is absolutely nothing that is unique for Uganda. The idea that early sexual debut for boys is almost promoted as a sign of masculinity and proving yourself, or is almost a rite of passage. There also have been documents within this project and within this research around young people who are perpetrators of kind of social justice social justice against people, both young women and young men, who have been sort of found to have immoral behaviors, such as having sex outside of marriage, or for drunkenness, for example, within these contexts, where there have been reports of kind of gang rape as a way of providing community justice, where those perpetrators are actually held up in social regard for having executed community justice within that context. So what does this mean for prevention program? The argument that the authors are really trying to make with this study, and this is very much an emerging agenda for UNAIDS. This is an agenda that the UNAIDS Prevention Division is developing together with Nicola Desmond and various other researchers, is really to develop and promote and kind of support a new agenda for HIV prevention among young people that really takes this into account and takes these types of social and localized understandings of norms and risk seriously, and really tries to find models of how you can integrate that within your program design. And we need models that take them into account, both the social risk settings in which young people are almost socialized into adopt risky behaviors, or could potentially be socialized into adopting risky behaviors. And we need to acknowledge the underlying sort of social norm and the broader risk landscape in redefining the future for targeted behavioral prevention approaches. That need to exist sort of alongside and complementary and arguably even integrated into biomedically informed combination prevention packages. Sexual behavior of young people needs to really be, well, re-scripted at the micro level, and thinking about sexual scripts and sexual, what is desirable and what is appropriate sexual behavior from the perceptions of understanding that local culture, and not even just one culture, because there are often going to be many cultures, and there's going to be your youth culture, which in itself is also going to have implications within your prevention program. And finally, social interventions that really acknowledge the role of the wider community as it informs young people's behavior need to be promoted alongside the situated understanding of local risk contexts, and interventions that change youth and community norms through transformative processes that focuses on, for example, community leadership, community social change processes through social dialogue, through working with parents, through working with understanding the processes of socialization within the community, as well as within the individual level. And that this is something that we, I think, as a community, need to start really thinking about what the implications are for programming. And in the notes it says I, but of course it's Dr. Nicola Desmond. would like to thank UNAIDS for supporting this new approach, and in particular Martina Brostrom and the Prevention Division for recognizing the gap in moving forward a behavioral prevention approach for young people. And she wants to thank Dr. Vera Pierroth, the Executive Director, and the rest of the USIKWASA team for their commitment to the Pangani community in Tanzania, and for promoting real and lasting and sustained behavior change. And finally, Dr. Daniel Wright, of the Medical Research Council Social Public Health Sciences Unit at the UK for his support for her research along with the shores of Lake Victoria in Tanzania. So thank you.